obvious that if you were driven, you know, to be as fast as possible, to have this huge competition, then you would also be likely to cut corners, and that, you know, you get results that can't be reproduced. Now, there have been fantastic manifestos about, you know, how to deal with this crisis, and this is all very good. And I thought that, you know, people really want to do something about it. And my idea was a little bit, I think, slightly facetiously sort of modeled on fast food. You know, the idea that we don't have to eat fast food. It's actually nice to have old-fashioned slow food, quality rather than quantity. And I said, why shouldn't we do that in other spheres of life? Why shouldn't we try and get more attention to quality than to quantity? So then I was actually asked to write this paper because I kept talking about this, you know, gave little talks to different groups and things. And it, of course, was very, very tough for me, because actually the person who asked me from TICS, the editor, said, well, what we really want is suggestion of what to do about it. And I said, oh my God, that, of course, I don't know. It's obviously a difficult thing, won't happen overnight. You know, it really is to do with changing research culture, with persuading people that you can do less but better. So I think maybe that's sufficient for the moment, and certainly happy to enter discussion later.
Great. Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, I think at this point we just sort of open it up for discussion, and also this isn't like, you know, question Uta. You know, this is a discussion amongst all of us. So let's, you know, feel free to keep it open. I find usually in a group this size it works fine if we all just sort of, you know, try to take turns and speak up. If we get a lot of, you know, running into each other, we'll have to start using the chat, and then I'll call on people. But I think free form should work fine. So if anybody would like to get us started with a comment or a question for the group.
Well, I have a question, or a sort of a, I guess, a question and a comment. So I'm thinking about one of the either consequences or drivers of fastness, right, is this, that we have more publication outlets, we have shorter briefer report formats, we have open access journals, which, you know, faster times to publications. And in some sense, you could imagine that all of these things would make it the sort of participation in science more democratic, right? In a sense, right? It would favor diversity of thought, maybe give greater access to this marketplace of ideas. But practically or pragmatically, that's not what's happening necessarily, right? So it seems to be doing the, you know, sort of the opposite, or at least also encouraging this fast science. And I'm kind of interested in, how do we ensure that we maintain these sort of access to resources, if you will, or access to outlets for airing ideas, while at the same time slowing things down, right? In the way that was suggested, that Uta suggested, Dr. Frith suggested in the article. So
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's the impact of this for sort of resource allocation and equity seems to be an important one, you know, to me. I'm not sure exactly what the proliferation of publications has done to access or equity. I sort of get the impression it's easier to find more diverse sources now, because we all have access to these search engines and there are so many publications, and, you know, something can achieve its own reputation without necessarily being in a high profile journal. But if we were to voluntarily reduce the number of publications, I'm not sure whether that would change that dynamic or not.
I think there are ways. I'm very, very sympathetic to this approach, and I totally agree that we are producing way too much without enough thought behind it. But I think that a more hybrid approach might be a better way to go. That is a way in which we can use the resources to very, very quickly get up some new data for open review. But focus on longer, more theoretically motivated, get published in a more robust, peer-reviewed fashion. I know one of the things that's happening in physics, and physics is a much, much smaller field than psychology, obviously, but one of the things that's happening in physics is that people are just putting up on their websites as soon as they find something. And they say, this is not yet peer-reviewed, this is just what's kind of my lab. And so that if you're working in that area, it almost becomes a more collaborative way of sharing things quickly before you publish it. So I think that's interesting. I don't think we're ever going to put the genie back in the bottle, right? People are going to want to get the word out. The other thing I'd say about open science, which I have very mixed feelings about because it really has unintended consequences. We spent years as psychologists doing essentially free labor in terms of reviewing articles, being journal editors. We get very small stipends for that. You get nothing for reviewing articles as a peer reviewer. So it's extra work for us. And of course, then we don't get paid for what we publish. Now we have to pay to publish. So it's definitely disenfranchising those who do not get whatever resources they need, access to grants or university resources. So I think the unintended consequences, while I'm in favor of the idea of open science, I think the unintended consequences are actually restriction of what gets out there.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Another unintended consequence of this open access model is, of course, that anybody who pays can get their stuff published, however bad it is. They will find a place.
And the consequence of that, and because we have these wonderful search engines, is that when I write a paper and want to make some statement, I can find all those papers that agree with me, or have found the right data apparently, and I can ignore all the ones that haven't.
But how do you find the ones that don't agree?
I don't look for them.
Yeah, magnifies bias. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of problems with the publication situation that need to be resolved. So I wonder if it really, the underlying thing has more to do with the incentive structure, rather than we sort of like, oh, you should have a certain number of publications or not, and they should be in certain journals. I think what feeds both of these problems is a lot about how we incentivize people.
So Dietz, would you say more? What do you mean by incentivize people? I mean, like what aspects of the incentive?
Well, I mean, it's that the whole, selection for bad science argument, and the idea, what do you get rewarded for? And we count publications, we count, impact factors and that sort of thing. And this is very important for the kind of funding you get and whether you get promoted and all that. I mean, it's pretty much that's the game. And of course, if you try to game the game, which is what you're going to be pushed to do, you produce less good science and more publications and faster and faster, and you do it better if you get more resources, and then more resources flow to you, and it magnifies inequality. So I think there's a fundamental problem there.
Well, you're set aside.
Is it okay to talk about the idea of the set aside. Maybe you.
Well, so maybe if you produce more than 2 papers a year, your salary starts
Well,
being
one
reduced.
trend that I have noticed, which I thought was maybe a positive trend that might actually start to increase this attention. When you have to review, at least in the States, when you get asked to review for tenure or promotion, you're now restricted to submitting your 5 best articles. You don't submit everything you've written.
Right.
So now suddenly your 5 best become really important. They better be really good, which means maybe you've spent more time on them and put more into them. But I don't think it had well, I was hoping that would be kind of a process by which people wouldn't worry so much about publishing, 47,000 articles before tenure because they knew they could only send out 5.
But the problem that can still be gamed in the sense, or at least the problem perhaps is that when you choose your 5 best articles, you don't actually choose the ones that are best. You choose the ones that have the highest citation rate. And that, again, I think that's something that should change, because
Yeah, can I say something? The citation rate is a very seductive measure. I mean, it seems an objective indicator. And we all love the idea that we don't, we can really measure something. And that, has...
And you don't have to read the paper.
You don't have to do anything else. And sad as it is, I think we might have to abandon this wonderful measure and really seriously think about how to get measures for quality. And I think this is an incredibly difficult problem because it brings in a kind of subjective element. And I've really tried to think about this and saying, who knows what is your best work? Is it you yourself? Is how soon after you've done it is this going to be known? 10 years later? Probably in some of the very most important discoveries, there had to be quite a long time before it could actually be evaluated. And that's so difficult. I wonder whether, there could be some kind of brainstorming session where people say, well, I judge quality like this, I judge quality like that. And maybe something might emerge that is sort of acceptable and even gives you at least some broad bands where you can put things in.
So to put things in context, I'm at the business school and I write for journals in organization and management. In our field, the citations you get are going to be highly dependent, or whether your paper gets read at all is going to depend very much on the impact factor of the journal that you publish it in. And high impact factor journals are all generalists, so they strive to appeal to a broad audience, which means that when you send papers in there, the review process is very slow. So it might take years to publish a paper, even if it is published at the first journal that you send it to, which is not very likely. So among my colleagues, so it's not just me, but colleagues who are really competent, good scientists, I find that they take years to publish a paper, and much of that work, those time, is spent rewriting the introduction. There's rarely any additional data collection, rarely any new analyses, but much of it is about crafting the front end, the framing, and there's now all these, people put a lot of thought and a lot of energy, in my view, an inordinate amount of thought and energy into conveying and conveying their ideas and convincing the reviewers that this is worthy of publication. Now, if journals had been more specialized so that you could send, so that you knew that the reviewers were on the same page with you, they understood the terminology, you didn't have to necessarily convince them, do as much convincing that this is an important problem, then the publication would be much quicker, and much more time would be spent doing the actual research and maybe doing additional studies to get to the bottom of things rather than staying on top of everything, right? So in my view, the part that is too slow is actually pushing people to focus on that part rather than do the real good science, you know, spend enough time focusing on what is good science and how can we get more deeper into the worthy questions. So I think a big chunk of the problem, at least in my field, is the way that journals are organized and how we have ranked them on prestige in a way that puts the generalist journals at the top of the prestige hierarchy. And also the tenure system and all that supports that, where if you have these articles in A journals, you know, they seem more valuable, even on the face of it. You know, personally, you might think the other one is a better work because it is more fundamental, it is more basic, it is, you know,
Interesting.
more paradigm shifting. So, you know, as you know, I don't have tenure yet, and one of the problems I have in thinking about this is, where do I send my work? And obviously there's trade-offs to be made there. And I don't know that my committee would read the journal article that came out in No Name Place, even if I think that is my best work, because you know, I got tired of dealing with, you know, back and forth and thought, you know, this needs to get out so people read it. So, but these are questions that are beyond the boundaries of institutions even, because these journals are organized in a very decentralized fashion by professional societies, publishers are involved. So I don't really know where one would start to tackle these problems.
May I push back a little bit on that? I take your point. I think there need to be different kinds of journals, and I think some of them need to be generalist and some of them may need to be very, very technical specific. The reason that the generalist journals have higher impact factors is because they actually reach a larger audience. And if we're talking about the impact of our work, there's different ways to think about that. I think you're making a really interesting point that sometimes in some areas of research, the impact is really in a very, very specific, very, very specific area, and it may be just as fundamental and important as in a bigger area. So I think that is something we need to think about. But I also think that as researchers and as the kinds of commitments we make to the research community and to society at large is to disseminate our work in ways that a larger audience can understand. Not all of it. I mean, some of it, I agree, you need to be very technical. So I think it's an important balance to keep in mind. I also think, and I don't know what's happening in the business journals, but in the psychology journals, and I've actually stopped publishing in most psychology journals because they restrict you to like these 4,000 words. How can you possibly develop a theoretical rationale? And I'm a developmental psychologist, so you know, you really have to think about process and change and mechanism. I think you always do, but I think as a developmentalist, we're really, really trained in that. How do you even begin to describe the history
of this problem and the issue you're addressing in a 1,000-word introduction. So we're losing our science. All we have are numbers. We don't actually have science anymore because we have no theory anymore.
I was going to say that there's a lot, particularly in psychology, there's too much data and not enough theory. And just putting out data doesn't help.
It used to be, I think, or that's, I don't know if this is accurate, but my perception is that a couple decades ago, for instance, in a field like sociology, you would have very reputable specialist journals, so sociology of crime, sociology of organizations, sociology of gender, not necessarily called with these names, but very reputable journals that specialize in areas within sociology. And then the higher impact, broad appeal journals would be things like annual review journals, right? So there you would have more theoretical pieces that didn't have data, but would summarize a field or summarize one topic of interest for a general audience that would be accessible to all. And they would be the higher impact papers, but not people wouldn't be expected to publish one of those until they were considered senior enough to do that. And often you might be invited to do such a summarizing work, but you would, the way to establish your competence and show it would be to actually publish in specialist journals. And one reason I wanted to join the conversation today is because I'm going to be coordinating the PhD program in the organizational management area. And I see this as a problem, today's problem, as very pertinent to the way we educate our PhD students. So when I was a student many years ago, we weren't necessarily expected to have a publication when we went on the market. Whereas today, our graduates cannot get a job unless they have a publication. So within the 5-year frame that they are with us, they need to learn the methods, learn to do good science, write a paper, and publish it. Given that publication now takes 2 years, it doesn't leave enough time for them to really, publish something where they can demonstrate real competence in the science, in the method of it. So now there are postdocs, but they're not as available to everybody. They're not, there are constraints around funding to extend students' time with us. It's not necessarily productive spending that time learning how to frame for a generalist audience while, there's still the valuable work of learning how to do research remains. So, yeah, I agree with you that it's important to share our work and to write it for a broad audience and to make it accessible. I think the pandemic has made it very obvious that science is not understood widely, and we need to do a better job with that. But I don't know that necessarily high impact journals or academic journals need to be the ones or carry the burden of that. And I'm not sure they're doing a good job at that either. So.
I'm struck, there's kind of a thread running through this is again, just the assessment of quality, both, before publication and in terms of a review process, which is supposedly what gives these high journals their status, is that, it's a very rigorous review and very selective and all of that. And then after the fact, how do we measure, somebody's contribution and productivity? And if we could solve that sort of problem, I think a lot of these other things would be easier to wrestle with, but it's a really, really hard problem. And we've kind of got this, the system we have is the worst possible one, except for all the others, right? It's, how are you going to, the peer review process, we've all had bad experiences with that, both probably, as receiving reviews and as being editors, where you ask somebody to do a review and they don't do well, it's not reliable. It becomes hard, particularly, this center that we're involved in is an interdisciplinary one. And sort of interdisciplinary papers are very hard to find the right reviewers and get a good review and a good evaluation. And so it's very challenging, and that's even prior to publication. And then after publication, well, we've got this sort of democratic process of, well, how many people cite it over a certain number of time, which has an appeal, but as you know, democracy can be subject to all sorts of its own problems and get twisted as well. So, but I'm not sure that we've, on the flip side, decided, do you really want the evaluation of the quality to entirely rely on these subjective appraisal by a small number of people who are on some kind of panel or something? Did you get the right people? Do they know your topic? In anthropology, this would be a huge problem for us. We have some people over here doing ethnographies, others are doing archaeology, some are working with hormones. It's very hard to see what would be a better solution. I mean, ideally, as scientists, we'd like to do some research and get some evidence-based answers and try some, but I don't know how long that project would take or who would fund it. I guess that's another issue, is that we have a coordination problem and that there is no governing body, so you just have competing interests. So that's not by way of any solutions, but it's just some problems that I see, I think, are running through a lot of this discussion.
To this interesting problem about the high status generalist journals, it seems to me that there would be space for more. Why is it that we only have so few and everybody wants to get in there? And they were there when there were far fewer scientists, far fewer publications, and far fewer universities too, or research institutes. So this hasn't grown to this extent that the research capacity has grown. And I don't really know what it is that makes people quite reluctant to get a new nature or a new science or a new journal that would be prestigious. But I presume you can't just say, oh, this is going to be a prestigious journal, because it's not up to you to say this.
Isn't eLife an attempt to do this?
Has it succeeded? Has anyone published in eLife?
I got rejected there, so that's counting.
Not very produced. Yeah. We were going in two different directions on that. Yeah.
I think there's another dimension here, and that is, how do we even define research and productivity? And this is something, there's a way in which this doesn't come from top down, but really comes from faculty themselves. At least, again, in the States, that it's departments that decide if somebody, that's the first barrier or obstacle or gate through which you make a decision about whether one of your colleagues is going to be put up for tenure. And then it moves to an interdisciplinary faculty committee. I mean, ultimately it is, the board of trustees, but I'm thinking about some of and this is maybe more specific to Emory, but some of the ways that teaching has changed in terms of the way we define what do we mean by excellent teaching. And it's not just getting good student evaluations in the classroom. It's about using innovative pedagogical strategies. It's about mentoring. It's about outreach. It might be about, having students in your lab and being generative that way. So it's not a one size fits all, but it's really a portfolio model. We say the same thing about research, but we actually could do more around that. Because when push comes to shove, what we really end up doing is counting the number of journal articles in high impact journals. But what if we were serious about that? What if we said, yes, here's a colleague who really has not published that many journal articles, but
look at the quality of these journal articles, or look at the public scholarship this person has done, look at other forms of, you know,
Methodological
look at how
innovation.
they've collaborated. They brought together this team of researchers that are off doing this really important work now, that they were part of this or part of that. I mean, I think that if we sat down and thought about what is a profile or a portfolio of a productive researcher, it would not be only quantity of journal articles. So maybe it's incumbent upon us as faculty to change the system and change the criteria by which we evaluate our colleagues.
What is this thing called DORA?
Oh, that doesn't apply, I think. Now, some people have said that one of the things that got sort of lost in research, the business of research, and in, you know, in promotions and all of these things.
You shouldn't call it business.
You shouldn't call, yeah. Is a sense of fun. And the question is, I think if it is not possible to slow down and, you know, think about bigger things, other things, then probably your work is not going to be as good. But of course, you will be always in competition with other people who somehow manage to be good and fast, which is very unfair, I think. The idea that perhaps, you know, together with the idea of evaluating quality in promotion, in all of this, there should also be a sense of how much thoughtfulness in a wider sense is in evidence. Very difficult, but I think people know what is meant by this, and students know if they're encouraged to stand back rather than only encouraged to produce and fit into some kind of schedule. So again, is it possible to, you know, to say to do less and reward that?
I think that's an excellent, it's hard to describe, right? This sense of thoughtfulness, or the sense of fun, or the sense of engagement, whatever commitment, whatever those. And I think that, you know, I think that and speaking to the PhD student training, I think we sort of lose a lot because we're being more encouraged to get our students out, right? Time to degree has to be, we have to compete with other institutions to get our students out in a timely fashion. And we're increasingly trying to reduce their coursework or other kinds of activities that they do so they can be in the lab, be in the lab, be in the lab, be in the lab, right? So they can produce those papers, so they can get those postdocs, so they can, and then so then we strip the thoughtfulness out of the process in some ways, you know, and I'm not sure quite what to do about that. I know that it also boils down to resources, right? So how do we support our students for these longer periods of time? But this has been troubling me, this kind of let's get things, let's get students out, and they have to be competitive. And I understand that there are professional reasons for that. But how to kind of stick a spoke in that careening wagon going down, but I resonate to that. We just aren't, we're increasingly not setting the system up for them to be able to be thoughtful.
I have a few thoughts while listening to this. In fact, we're sitting here and lamenting older times. well, we know that this, well, we cannot change, no matter how nostalgic we are on Once Upon a Time. So I want to make a few comments. First of all, about the PhD things that Ojekan, do I say your name correctly?
Özgecan.
Okay, thank you. So my daughter is working on her PhD at MIT now. And there, you don't have to publish. Your work needs to be publishable, which means that it's up to the faculty, as Robin suggested, to give more power for the faculty to decide about the quality of your work. And you are spared the Via Dolorosa of going through various journals, and which is something that is important to accomplish, but you are liberated from the need to fight over that. So your 5 or 6 years as a PhD student are really dedicated to producing a high quality work that your faculty would find okay. So this is one comment that I wanted to say, and it's coming from a high prestige institution, so it might be an idea of the school of how to approach this. The other thing is that I wonder, this sounds totally crazy, whether there should be a limit on how many publications a person may produce in a certain amount of time. Let's say you're not allowed to publish more than maybe a paper once a year, once every other year, whatever. So this creates a time frame that in fact you don't benefit from being fast and not so good, because you don't get rewarded for it anyway. In fact, you're not allowed to do that. And then, yeah, so more or less I said what I had to say.
Can I jump in with a point about, or a question or a thought about, you know, kind of the one downside, well, one of the downsides I see to limiting output is it will discourage collaboration. You know, if you're trying to, you know, if there really is a hard limit on you may publish, your name may be on one paper a year, you're going to make it your work. You are not going to lend your expertise or your data analysis skills to a collaborator in a field that's maybe not your own, you know, and if we're trying to go kind of multidisciplinary and collaborative, you know, there's one thing about being the third author on 4 papers or the first author on 1. You know, there's got to be, you know, there's got to be some way of, you know, given that we're trying to increase the people who get credit for the work and assign, you know, rather than kind of first author, senior author, kind of trying to decide this is the person who analyzed the data, these are the people who collected it, these are the people who manage the resources. If we're going to give credit in that way, which I think is probably a valuable thing to do, that in some ways works counterproductive to the limiting your output. So there's got to be a way of trading those two things off to encourage collaboration, give credit where credit is due, and recognize the efforts of people who may not traditionally have been considered authors on a paper, and yet kind of pare down what everybody's, you know, the need to be publishing 47 first author papers before you're
I think
12 years
extremely
old.
important point that you're bringing up. And I think that maybe this can be considered into the metric of how much you may publish, whether you are one of a team of a certain size or whether you are a sole author, or I think it might be a little bit more complicated metric, but I think it's doable if people consider going this way.
I think that that's actually something Uta did suggest in her paper, is, you know, kind of a limit, and it made me wonder if limits are necessarily the way to go, as opposed to, I think if you stopped heavily pushing people to publish as much as possible, that some people would adopt a different model. I mean, if there's multiple ways you can be successful and they don't all involve cranking out, then I think you would find some people found a better way this way. But there are, as you said, there are those people that are fast and good, and, you know, you don't want to tell them they can't either. But it has to be that there's more than one way to be a good scholar. Sorry, I think I cut off Megan. You were going to say
Oh,
something.
no, that's okay. During this conversation, I've been thinking about the idea of getting scooped in science and how a lot of, I think, the speed at which people are publishing right now is to be able to put a claim on some sort of intellectual property. And never 1 foot in, 1.5 anyway, but it's just how publication titles are getting more and more, this changes everything sort of style. So if we slow down, which I agree is something that should happen, and change the culture of publication, and every time you want to publish quickly so that no one takes your paradigm shift away from you.
There are ways now people use these archives like PsycArchive or, a lot to put their claim, their stake, so you can actually guard against, being scooped better than ever before. But the other thing is that it's really a myth. Of course, it's ridiculous to assume that every paper can be a breakthrough. And, there's this groundbreaking new discovery every day. This is complete nonsense. We just should abandon this idea, of course. And most of the time, science is cumulative. Of course, there's sometimes sort of extraordinary shifts which are marvelous, but again, they're unforeseen very often. And the idea really to make students like you think they're supposed to produce this groundbreaking research all the time, better and better. I mean, that's just such nonsense. Why do we get taken in by that?
That's how you you have to write your grant proposal that way, though.
Well, yeah.
I was thinking a bit about the kind of another aspect of sort of judging quality, right? And so one of quality or, might be considered paradigm shifting or something like that, right? But there's also the sort of the, and I'm not particularly involved in this, but there's sort of this also self-promotion part of science that, so there is the, you want to make it sound groundbreaking, or you want to present you're the best face of your work to a granting agency, but you're also tweeting. I mean, I'm not, but people are tweeting out their findings, right? Or they're retweeting with particular tags to make sure that so-and-so sees it. And so I think that's a sort of another aspect of sort of the fog of quality, right? Citations can follow tweets, maybe. I don't even know if that's true, but sort of this self-promotion of science as well. And I'm not sure what my point is exactly, or even if there's a question embedded in there, but I thought I would comment on that as well.
So does it have to do with this sort of general commercialization of science as well? This salesmanship and the idea that we, have to
well, turning universities into businesses.
Yeah. So It's certainly true.
I mean, this is beyond science. In general, students now are being encouraged to curate their social media identity to promote themselves and their professional goals. So I think that's even a larger issue than just what's happening in science. You know, when I started, we didn't have websites. You know,
we didn't have computers.
But now, I mean, if I had a, you know, and actually, to be honest with you, I stopped taking graduate students because I was struggling with this issue of this empirical treadmill that, you know, if you take a graduate student, you're making a commitment to help them get credentialed, that they're going to have to publish X number of articles before they graduate in order to get a postdoc. And I was like, I just don't want to be part of this system anymore. You know, you constantly have to get grant money to support them, etc. But you know, so that was a couple of years ago, and also I was moving into an administrative position. But I did tell my graduate students, you know, you have to have a website, you have to have a LinkedIn, you have to have an online professional profile. The world is different now. And so I do think that, I don't know exactly how that's related to slow science, but I think there's some link there. There's some link with this notion that you have to, even as a graduate student, you're presenting yourself as a full-on professional, fully cooked scientist, you know, and you're not. I mean, you shouldn't be, right? It takes a really, really long time. I'm still not a fully cooked scientist. And I think we've lost something of that it's really about a community of science, a collaboration, that it takes a really long time to do good science, and that it's not, you know, you can't do it. What is a tweet? 148 characters. You can't do science in 148 characters. And I'm going to just get on my soapbox. My real pet peeve in all of this is that we're moving students out of classrooms and into the labs, putting blinders on them. You have to become good at this method, this paradigm. This is what you read. This is what you know. And we've lost our entire really deep, important theoretical history. People never read the history in psychology anymore. And it is so rich. And I would say more than half of what I read in journals today connects to things that were written about 30, 40, 50 years ago. And the person writing it has no idea. So, my pet peeve.
I am a PhD student in club sciences, and I really feel everything. And as a PhD student, what I feel, or when I came to my program, is this environment in which nobody asks you who you are. Like, I don't know, I think that even if we are from different backgrounds, all the grad students are similar, highly competitive. We are always being trained like these kind of machines. We are replicates of the same, and we continue replicating that. And it's kind of sad because sometimes they are saying like you want to promote that you are be out of the box, but sometimes it's kind of hard because since day one you are telling you have to do this, by this semester you have to take so many classes, you have to prepare your qualifyings, then is the next research rotation, then is the thesis. It's a marathon that sometimes I feel that we don't have even time to think, to really like digest all that amount of science that Robin was mentioning, and it's 50, 100 years, because it's like you feel like a marathon. Literally, your body is like, and what I feel is also like, for me, I love science, I guess, as everyone else, like since we early age. But the only way that people tell us is academia, academia, academia. You cannot do science out of academia. Next time, nobody is asking me, do you want to do a postdoc? They are assuming that I'm going to do a postdoc. And if I try to say other things, I feel afraid of really saying, because they are saying, like, I'm like sometimes just a tool, but not a person. So it's kind of hard sometimes to really be who you want to be. You just follow what the people want to. Like, all, we are brilliant, and we just say what you want to hear. And then sometimes I put in my profile what you want to hear, or I put in a grant, and it's so sad because, but that's the environment that we continue creating. I think it's like I'm receiving that from my mentors, and then probably I'll replicate that with my students. And I don't know how to cut that. Like, yeah, it's fast science, but how we try to slowly move or make this change to slow science. I know that this is not science or academia. This is more intricate in whole system that we are living these current times, maybe because we have access to an amount of information. I don't know, I keep asking myself and reflectioning what I'm gonna do. I'm in my 30 years, but I feel tired now. I don't know when I'm gonna be 40 or 50, because it's like, I'm young, but I've been running. This is undergrad, then master, then PhD, then postdoc. Then I don't have time, because if it's short, and then if I want tenure track, if I don't want tenure track. And I said, I don't know, sometimes I love what I do, but sometimes I feel that I don't take a time to think and say, and that is something that I miss about science. I feel that sometimes we don't have this kind of reflections, even in the topics that we do. We just go, like someone gives a summary, oh, good job, bye. And it's like, so yeah, it's kind of my reflections about what you are mentioning, and after reading the article, and thank you for sharing all your comments.
I'm very sorry to interrupt for a minute to apologize. I must leave for another Zoom meeting. I would like so much to thank you for joining us from London, and for the thought-provoking and very important issues that have been brought in your paper. Okay, so thank you very much, and I apologize.
Thank you. I'm actually going to have to go in a minute too. Sorry, Natalia already got away. I just didn't, it's a sort of a parting shot. It just made me think about like an evolutionary biology framework, and maybe what we have is a mortality rate that's just too high, and it's kind of messed up our reproductive strategy into a rapid low investment kind of thing. So there's something about this, the speed of it, but there's also just the number of people versus the amount of resources may be a big problem. Speaking of which, I now have to go do something else because I have some other obligations. But thank you very much, all of you, for joining. Lynn will be your host now, and Uta and Chris, it was really nice to see you, and thanks for stopping in.
Thank you very much for including us. Really, really excellent. Thank you. So should we stop now?
Well, not Lynn yet.